Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Welcome to another edition of the Business of America. You know, our shows have been about the individuals, the men, the women in the arena, those who are making a difference, the doers of the economy, scientists, physicians, researchers, entrepreneurs, CEOs of companies, and all sorts of Americans who help run and drive the American economy. But as you know, and we always touch on, there's something called Washington, D.C., and every entrepreneur, every scientist, every innovator must deal with the regulations, the taxes, the public relations. Washington, for better or for worse, impacts our lives every day. Go to the grocery store and look at the impact of inflation, or go to a local small business and see if they're thriving or not. Or even in terms of science, you know, are we finding the new cures, the answers to the pandemics that are coming down the road? No, I mean, right? Government impacts these things. So today I thought we'd talk about the business of public affairs, the business of telling your story, of having an impact, of persuading in the public discourse, and how that impacts our lives, how that impacts kitchen table issues. To have this conversation, we have the expert of experts, a small business owner, former Senator Rand staffer, Senate counsel, former think tanker. He's an attorney. He is, in many ways, he's everything this show is about in terms of focusing on the man in the arena. So let me introduce to you, our audience, a good friend of mine, but also someone who has great insight in terms of how the public discourse works, how the economy works. And that is, of course, the president, the founder of Liberty Government Affairs. Again, my good friend, Brian Darling. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Yeah, just to put a little bit more meat in the bones, I worked for Senator Rand Paul for a couple of years. I have my own small business, Liberty Government Affairs, and I've worked in and out of Capitol Hill for the last 20 years. So I know a little bit about it, and I hope I can impart some of that knowledge to your listeners.
Well, here, Brian, let's start with having an impact on the public discourse. You know, the best advocates are those who are being impacted by the taxes, by the regulations. So a patient to talk about new cures, or a small business owner to talk about taxes and regulations, and an innovator to talk about the state of health and science and trust in public health. And so these are your clients. This is your universe. So talk a little bit about what you offer, and not just your business, but there's an industry of public affairs firms and publicists and public relations and advertising and all the rest of it. Tell us a little bit about your business, but also about this industry broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the industry has a number of goals. I mean, number one, if you're doing public relations, you're trying to tell a story. You're trying to tell the story of a company or an interest, but mostly a company, you know, and I do a lot of work with different companies that are trying to tell a story to Capitol Hill, to the White House, and basically to they want to define themselves, not to be defined by others. And most of the time they come to me when they're in trouble. You know, Washington, they shouldn't have to deal with Washington, but they're either hit with a regulation or they're hit with legislation that is pushed by their opponents to knock them out, crony legislation. For the most part, we need help. You know, we don't really like going to Washington. We shouldn't have to go to Washington, but we do, because they're about to regulate us, or about to tax us, or about to do something that's going to harm our business. So it's almost like a lawyer. You don't really ever want to have to hire a lawyer, but when you do hire one, you want somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who can navigate that area And so I can navigate that area. I've navigated that area for a number of clients. And for the most part, the job is to effectively tell their story when there's so many other stories being told too. I mean, one of the most important things is when you go to a meeting on Capitol Hill, I do some lobbying and mostly PR, but do some lobbying. You're going to meet with young staffers who don't know much about anything. I mean, they're just new to the business. They're the first line of taking in information for a Senate or House office. And so you go in and you talk to them and you're trying to get your message across. But you think about Capitol Hill, they're taking in messages through their staff, through member meetings, but they're also taking their messages in through the media. I mean, they read the media. My former boss, Senator Paul, would, look in the check out internet mentions of himself and check out sites that he liked. But all of your members get information from different places. Administration officials get information from different places. So you're trying to saturate the PR sphere in many ways through paid advertising, through placing op-eds, through getting your message out through major earned media. If a reporter's writing a story in your area, you want to get in that story and get your message out. So it's a pretty complicated area, but the bottom line is you're trying to represent the interests of your client, get their message out, whether it be defining themselves, whether it be, don't pass this legislation, it's going to hurt us and a bunch of other companies. But you basically have a center theme. We need to get X, Y, and Z message out.
Well, again, I have a lot of questions for you. I'll start here. There was a time, I've worked in healthcare policy and policy broadly for a long time. And there was a time not that long ago where if I talked to a reporter, a journalist from the New York Times on health policy, the reporter understood health policy, or at least had a basic understanding. I remember years ago, the New York Times, the dean of the healthcare journalist was a guy by the name of Robert Pear. And he's passed on since, but he was the dean. He was the expert. And so when I would talk to him about pharmaceutical issues or science issues or public health issues, pandemic vaccine issues, etc., he would have he had expert knowledge, but my expectation was he would know something about what we're talking about. So my question to you, that's a long way for me to ask the question. Part of your purview is to deal with the media. But how do you deal with a media that is not expert or is not well grounded in the myriad subjects, topics, issues that you have to address?
Good question. I mean, some of the reporters are, if it's their lane, they have a very deep understanding of the companies and the issues surrounding the companies. But, a lot of them some of them are in the report on just lobbying, some report on tech issues, some report on healthcare issues, some just report on economic issues. So when you get into the specialists, they do know what they're talking about, but many reporters don't. As you know, you get a lot of reporters that are either new to the beat or they just don't have a deep understanding of a certain aspect of one issue, and you have to educate them. And so, it's kind of a 101 educate them. But
let me interrupt you real quick. So you have to educate them, and I understand that, especially with a lot of newer, younger reporters. I'm finding that reporters get involved in journalism because they want to change the world. Not report the news or investigate a topic. So if a reporter has a bias and you're trying to educate that reporter and they have an anti-business bias, how do you get around that? What tactics do you take?
I mean, you just do your best to educate on what your company does or what the interest you're representing does, and hope that breaks through. I mean, you are dealing with a lot of inherent biases. I see it every day. You talk to a reporter, some of them have just unique biases that you just wouldn't expect, but a lot of them do have a change the world bias. They're here to change the world and to beat everybody up. And, you also have the situation where reporters treat you as an enemy. They are seeking prey. They're seeking a story.
Yes.
And there's some that are just trying to write a story and a balanced story and just do their job. So you have that different aspect, the hostile interviews versus
Sure.
interviews more friendly where they're actually seeking the truth. But you also have a lot of partisans. I mean, we see it every day on, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, where you have more partisan, I wouldn't call them reporters. I'd call them kind of a fusion of reporting and opinion. It's a little bit of mix of both. And it's a world we live in. You get a lot of reporters that do that. You're dealing with some of the different platforms. Some of them have a view. Some of them are conservative. Some of them are liberal.
What about that revolving door? And again, I don't want to get too far away from the business of public affairs, but there is this revolving door where George Stephanopoulos was a Democrat staffer. You have the Jen Psaki is now a host at MSNBC. Meet the Press, the former, his name escapes me right now, Chuck Todd. Chuck Todd was a aide to a Democratic senator. And I'm sure this is true on the right, where there are members of the Republican Party or conservatives who go from politics into media. And again, in terms of public affairs, I see this as a way to educate the public and the public discourse. But again, when you have this revolving door, is it more gamesmanship? Is it all politics? Or do you find, here's the question in my wordiness, do you find even those who are partisan, are they sometimes persuadable?
Yeah, no, they are. I think they are when you confront them with facts. And I've had a couple circumstances where reporters have called me and it seems like their story's already written. And then they just want to plug in a quote. They just want a quote from me. Or, they have some bias or some angle to or a theme to their story. And when you confront them with facts, sometimes you blow it up. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes they'll run with it and they don't care what you say. But, the ethical reporters will listen to you. And if they are proven wrong, then all of a sudden they have to scrap the story and move on to the next one. But you do find that some of the partisans or some of the ones that are just hostile, just want to put some points on the board, will run with stories, even if they know they're not right. And then there are others that are more ethical that will listen to you and at least try and seek the truth, come as close to the truth as they can.
It's interesting. From my days in working on the Hill, but also working at think tanks, and then later on, of course, as you know and our audience knows, I spent a lot of years working on K Street, in a trade association, a lobbying organization. And I remember I would call reporters. Part of my purview was to deal with third parties and the media. And I remember years ago, I'd call old friends of mine from the think tank world, friends of mine from the American Enterprise Institute or the Manhattan Institute or Aspen or wherever. And their attitude toward me, at least professionally, had changed. Hey, I'd like to invite you to a dinner with an expert. Sorry, Jerry, you're a corporate sponsor. You're sponsoring this dinner. Therefore, really, I'm not sure if I should attend. It's biased information. So not only can reporters be biased, but sometimes they think the information coming to them, if it is paid for or provided by an entrepreneurial interest or a special interest or a corporate interest or a science interest, they dismiss it out of hand. How do you get beyond that? How do you get past that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. I mean, if you do host a lunch and you want to have reporters come in and sit down at the lunch, some of them just won't show up because they don't, it's a lunch that they have to pay for themselves and they're worried about the information, where it comes from. But ultimately, I don't understand why more reporters don't do it. But you also have the other side. You have reporters that basically get pre-baked stories sent to them and they run with it. And, we've seen that a lot, where basically a PR firm will have this theme, this story ready to go. They'll find a friendly reporter, say, go get them, go get our enemies. And the reporters will run with the story. And that happens quite a bit too. So it's two sides of a coin. Sometimes there are reporters that are acting ethically by not listening to the corporate interests or the PR firm. Sometimes they go too far and they're too careful. And that means they're not going to learn anything. Going to a lunch is not a big deal.
I'll give you an example. So years ago, this is almost 20 years ago, when the Democrats won the midterms, the 06 midterms, and Nancy Pelosi became speaker, first Democrat speaker in a long time, first female speaker. And their first bill, their first piece of legislation out of the box was, it was H.R. 1, and it was a price control bill. On big pharma, on bad, evil big pharma. Anyway, we had lots of friends. I was at pharma, and we had lots of friends in the patient community. not in the partisan think tankers or conservative think tank, in the straight down the road patients, because they understood that pharma was an important partner in finding new cures, providing medicines and therapies. Anyway, in those days, we had Blackberries. Remember, Brian? Remember the Blackberry? So I had my Blackberry, and I was getting reports from this meeting. And someone had asked the question, and this was from a left of center patient organization headed by a Democrat, wanted to know why the pharma companies weren't in the room to have this conversation. And Nancy Pelosi's response and her healthcare expert at the time's response was, well, they're the enemy. They didn't say it like that, but they more or less said they're the enemy. Why would they be here? And the patient community responded by saying, well, no, they're not this is where the medicine comes from. If we're going to talk about costs and prices and access, how do you not have those people who are providing the access and all the rest of it? How do you not have them in the room? So there is this business in DC where we leave people out of the room. How do you work to bring parties together, even when they don't have the same interests or they're opposing interests?
Yeah, it's hard to do sometimes. You try and get it done. And, for example, say if I'm doing outreach or trying to influence somebody who is on the other side of an issue, who's dug in, against my position on an issue, my client's position on an issue, you do your best to persuade, but you also do your best to expose them if you think they're wrong, if they're doing it for the wrong reasons. I mean, sometimes it's friendly persuasion. Sometimes you're beating up a member of Congress. You're beating up a person in the administration who's doing something that you think is wrong, and you're exposing them. And that helps to move the dial sometimes. I mean, you have a lot of bureaucrats that feel like they can do things that are under the radar. It happens a lot in a regulatory state. We have regulations being rolled out by bureaucrats that are harmful to our economy. And nobody knows who they are. They're not elected by anybody. They're just people who are appointed to a position, and they're, putting forth the position. They're basically legislating, from the executive branch, which is a big problem with our government right now. And how do you fight back against that? I mean, your clients say, oh, can we sue? Well, suing is not going to do anything. You really need to go to Capitol Hill and get the legislators to put some pressure on administration officials to do the right thing, or to legislate a change and to do something through legislation. And, again, I step back and always say that you have a lot of clients that say, oh, Washington, they're horrible. All they do is do bad things to us. They tax us, they regulate us, they tell us what to do. They're always mad at us. They try and haul us in for hearings. And it's true. And, you try and do your best to navigate troubled waters here. I always tell clients, it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. You have to get your message out there. You're going to lose. And you can be 100% right and say, what do I need to do anything on? I'm right. And they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. The government should not be doing this to us, but it doesn't matter. You have to get into Washington and fight, get that message through, and do your best to defend yourself, because government does a lot of bad things, especially to corporate America.
Well, a couple of things here. And I know that you have a piece that you wrote this week. I'm not sure when people will see this podcast. This should drop tomorrow. So it'll be relevant and in real time, or tonight. But you have a piece on the Chevron decision. And so a couple things here, and I want you to talk about this piece. Number one, it seems to me in the last 10 years, maybe longer, we don't have Congress legislating. Congress will pontificate and politic, but they don't legislate. Or they write omnibus pieces of legislation that include so many topics that you need an army of lobbyists and attorneys and others to interpret. Or they take a bill like the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's really a green energy, a Green New Deal Act, but they give it a name that's innocuous or a name that's popular. So Congress doesn't do its job often, and when it does do its job, sometimes there's a lack of transparency and there's an overload of nuance and issues. So therefore, the bureaucratic state has to take what Congress did and interpret it and implement it. This is why we see a rush for rules and a rush for executive orders. Donald Trump issued X amount of executive orders. Joe Biden has come back issuing executive orders. The infamous Obama, I have a pen and a phone, that he could legislate. Criticism of the court, the Supreme Court, the court shouldn't legislate. So talk a little bit about, if Congress did its job, we would all be better off, businesses and individuals and families, citizens broadly, but the economy also. But also talk about the Chevron decision, because there's a lot of, I think, misinformation that this is going to mean the administration can no longer regulate, that they're taking the protections away from the people, and we're going to have environmental issues and all kinds of bad things happening. So talk about Congress doing its job, and talk about this Chevron decision.
Yeah, and the Chevron decision, I wrote a piece at Real Clear Policy that discusses the fact that decision, the decision that came down, repealed the so-called Chevron doctrine. And that doctrine been in place for 20, 25 years, where basically the courts allowed bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, to fill in the blanks where legislation didn't give them specific
ad lib, like Mad Libs. Remember Mad Libs?
Yeah, do it whatever you think you want to.
Yes.
But, the court said that that's a violation of the separation of powers, because your executive branch executes the laws; they don't make the laws. And so you had unelected bureaucrats basically writing law and doing whatever they wanted. And they claimed they were filling in the blanks of legislation, interpreting legislation. We see this a lot. I mean, we see this where basically they'll take a piece of legislation and they'll interpret it in a way that doesn't resemble the legislation at all. And so the court said you can't do that anymore, and that's a great thing. Of course, the left's freaking out, saying, "Oh, our environment's going to be destroyed because a lot of these regulations that were issued are going to be repealed." But the truth of the matter is, if they're popular, if the American people want them, then Congress can pass it. And you're absolutely right about Congress. They have not been doing their job. They love kicking decisions.
And this is a bipartisan not doing their job. When the Democrats are in control, they punt the ball. When Republicans are in control, they don't legislate. So go ahead, finish your thought.
No, you're right. I mean, they don't like doing their job. They like kicking decisions to other people, because then they can, if it goes well, they can say, "Oh, we support that." If it goes poorly, they can say, "Well, we had nothing to do with it."
That's a brilliant point. And it's not that long ago, during COVID, where you had, now this isn't necessarily the Congress, but you had state legislatures, you had legislators around the country who refused to push back on the public health establishment, on the governors. But even here in D.C., the Congress refused to act because they didn't want to get it wrong. They didn't want to say, open the economy, or you can't do this, or these mandates are not constitutional, as a violation of free speech. These censorship issues, we can't be engaged in censorship. But they didn't act because they were afraid, well, what if I do act and then 100,000 people die? And so that it does take a certain kind of, I don't know, what's the word for it, wise valor to be a member of Congress, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, a great example of that is what happened when Congress passed the COVID relief bill.
Yes.
Giant bill. It was a $2 trillion bill. And a House member from Kentucky, Thomas Massey, went down to the floor. And all he wanted to do was get a recorded vote. He didn't want a voice vote. He wanted to put everybody on the record to say, how are you going to vote in the biggest spending bill in our nation's history? And the leadership said, "Oh, no, we don't want that." And
that was Republican leadership or Democratic leadership?
Republican leadership. Republican leadership didn't let him get a vote. His own party didn't let him get a vote. And, Democrats are on board, too. They could have helped him to get a vote. They didn't want to get a vote either. So both the leadership of both parties, the uniparty, as they call it, no, we don't want to vote, because ultimately, if it went sideways, they wanted to be able to say, well, I supported some aspects of it, but I didn't support others. I don't know if I would have voted for that, but it leaves them off the hook. And so it's similar to when you hear members of Congress saying, let's sue to get X, Y, and Z done, or let's write a letter, a strongly worded letter to the administration saying, don't do this. But that's not what Congress does. Congress, when they write, they're writing laws. They write laws, and that is their job. And they don't like doing their job, because if they do it and they get it wrong, then they get blamed, and then they don't get reelected. So any opportunity for them to shirk responsibility. For the most part, they like to do. There are a handful of members that are brave and willing to fight, but for the most part, a lot of them just like having their jobs, and they like going along to get along.
Yeah.
And what problem does that cause for people like us is trying to get the message across, because it's hard to explain why Congress acts like this, why Washington acts like this, where they whenever there's a problem, they point at somebody else and say, it's not my fault. Something went wrong, but I didn't
It's
do
always someone else's fault.
Yeah.
It's always the boogeyman. It's
either one party or the other,
right?
Or it's a different branch of government. We're seeing a lot of fingers pointed at the Supreme Court. Oh, the Supreme Court is doing all these horrible things, and there's nothing we can do about it. Maybe we need to expand the court or start impeaching members of the court. But it's always somebody else. All politicians love to point at somebody else.
Well, let me ask you this, because I'm a despairing optimist, and I've said this 1,000 times on this podcast. For the audience, you could hear Brian Darling every Sunday on the Jerry Rogers radio program out of Baltimore, WBAL. We do a thing called the Liberty Update, where we kind of talk about an issue or a problem and try to also offer up some solutions or some ideas on how to fix things. So I'm going to do that here with you now, Brian. There are lots of problems. If legislation worked, if Congress worked as it should, if people understood the facts, and the facts were reported by the Fourth Estate, that the media was holding the powerful accountable, there might be less need for the public affairs industry. And don't get me wrong, I think the work you do is important. I think it's amazing how much the American public they don't realize that a lot of what happens in D.C. and state capitals around the country, the public affairs experts have a lot to do with this. But however, I'm going to ask you, because you are someone who's a patriot, you're an attorney, you've served in think tanks, you've public service on Capitol Hill, you're an entrepreneur, you've started your own business. Can we fix things? And are there some incremental change or incremental things we can do to make things better?
That's a great question. I mean, I would say, can we fix things? No. But can we make things incrementally better?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you're going to give me, I feel like Red Fox in Sanford and Son. Oh, I'm coming home, having a heart attack.
We're never going to fix Washington. But, I'll give you a good example. I mean, back in the day, Bobby Byrd, a Democrat senator from West Virginia, used to always say, whenever lobbyists would come into his office, why do you need a lobbyist? You just come in and talk to me. I'll help you out. And that was an older attitude. That was an attitude back in the day where members, they had just a different perspective on the way Congress should run. Now it's, K Street is just loaded with professionals, and you've just got an expansion of PR firms and lobbying firms. And I don't think it's a good thing, but it's kind of necessary, because ultimately, what are we doing? We're exercising the First Amendment rights of the American people and corporations to help them.
Let me remind our listeners that it's not just big, bad corporate interests who have lobbyists and public affairs experts and attorneys. No, it's also labor unions, it's public sector unions, it's the nonprofit world. I mean, this battle of ideas is, if you had to make the case, it probably tilts towards the left. More money, more organization. There's, for every lobbyist for big pharma or some other big entity, big oil, there's a Soros funded effort on the other side. So there is this. It's a multi ideological playing ground. It's not one side and not the other.
But there's also, think about what did our federal government spend last year? Over $6 trillion. I mean, if our federal government's obviously spending more than they're taking in, but they're spending over $6 trillion. They're regulating, they're taxing. The tax code is extremely complicated. Yeah. There are all these provisions, and there's some spending in the tax code, and the regulations are out of control. And so, it's a kind of a necessary evil, I'd say, to have lobbyists and PR firms.
Well, let me throw this at you. And I've talked to you about this before. I think there's one reform Congress can do to get us back on the right road, and that is simply returning to regular order, right? Have the spending bills be debated, have hearings, have opportunity for amendments, let the minority also propose things. In other words, Congress should get back into the sausage making game and making compromises. We don't do that. That is both sides. Republican speakers and Democratic speakers have gone off the rails. There is no regular order, number one. And number two, I'm wondering if there's a change. And what I mean by that is this. You mentioned the big spending. The big government spending has led to inflation. I mean, it's 4th of July in some jurisdictions, people paying 4 times as much for their barbecue. We just got news the last couple of weeks that people aren't going on vacation because they can't afford it. We hear a lot about, rent is out of, in Maryland, a new report that most working families can't afford rent. And so for the first time in a very long time, maybe since the Carter years, citizens, Democrats and Republicans, are feeling impact of what's happening in D.C. And you see a change. Last week, last program, we had Tim Stewart on the program from U.S. Oil and Gas, the big boogeyman, the oil and gas people. But he said that he's noticing a change, that their message is breaking through. And the reason is because of how high energy costs are, because how high it costs to fill up your car with gas. And so normal people, the normies, are feeling the impact. So here's the question. I'm being wordy again. So question is, will going back to regular order help us get back on the right road? Number one. Number two, the fact that these policies now are impacting family businesses and family lives and working people, will that force people to think differently and perhaps even vote differently? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think on both points you're right. I think, first of all, going with regular order and having single subject bills,
yes,
Congress doing their appropriations bills the way they're supposed to instead of as one giant $6 trillion spending bill, breaking them down into 13 different categories of bills.
Thousands of pages.
Yeah, be very helpful. I mean, doing that. And you're right. You're absolutely right that average Americans are feeling the pinch now. And we're seeing a disconnect with this administration and Congress to an extent saying, oh, the economy is great. Things are wonderful. When Americans know that's not true. Whenever they go to the grocery store, they're paying a lot more for groceries.
Let them eat cake, except we can't afford the cake.
When you fill up your gas tank, you're spending more money. And it's obvious that corporations aren't causing inflation. They can't. The only entity that can cause inflation is government, because government prints some money, government spends more than they take in, and that devalues the currency. And so the American people understand. They understand that what they're hearing from Washington is a lot of hot air when it comes to, oh, the economy is great, things are wonderful. And I do think that single subject bills will allow the American people to actually participate more in the process, because right now they're not participating enough. It's all these elites in Washington doing what they do, doing giant omnibus bills and not listening to the American people and not letting them have their say, which is not what our government was set up to do.
No, you're right. And again, you do important work. You're educating the public discourse. Look, I'm a guy who understands and loves American history. And one thing that our founding fathers feared more than anything else, and that was politics or leadership by whim, by the mob. And unfortunately, I think the mob is winning in D.C., and therefore we need safeguards, and we need truth tellers. And again, to your original point, I think facts matter. I think the truth matters, and the more we can push back with the truth, I think we will hit the right tone and be on the right course. But also, I think compromise. I do think that, being at the table is important, and getting a slice of the pie or a slice of the loaf. We don't need the whole loaf. And I think sometimes in this environment, Democrats and Republicans are fearful to work together because their base in a primary might come after them. It seems to me, in my last statement, and I'll give you the last word, I think we need more legislators who don't want to be legislators. That if they lose, they lose. And if they lose on principle, they lose because they're doing the right thing, serving their constituents. I think eventually that could become the norm Who knows? Maybe I'm too much of an optimist. But I'll give you the last word, Brian Darling.
You probably will disagree with this, but I believe in a very radical idea: single-term term limit. So you actually have the American people serving in Washington. It'd be great to have your House members serve one term, get in, get out, 2 years, and have your senators one term, get in, get out.
I'm going to extend the show now by a few minutes. It's funny you say that, Brian, because I was going to ask you about term limits earlier. We're coming up on the end of the show, but I've never heard you say this, and I'm not even sure I've seen a proposal for single term limits where everyone serves one term.
One and done. You come in, you get out. And, we have term limits for the presidency. And look at how different our country would be if we didn't. I mean, we would have a much different history. We would probably have presidents that are more so treated as kings, because they would probably stay forever until they pass away. And then the next person would come in and serve until they passed away. But you have a problem in Congress where most of the members that are there for a long period of time, they don't get better for the most part. They get worse, and they become more part of the system. There's an incentive structure in Congress. If you want to be chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, you got to be in Congress for a long time. If you want to be chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it takes a long time to get there. You got to stick it out. But I just think that there needs to be a mechanism. Maybe it's not my idea, but maybe a mechanism, some sort of term limits to make sure that you have citizen legislators.
Because you are the expert here, former counsel to members of the Senate. To do this would have to be a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think is there an appetite for it? Do you think the American people are ready for something like this?
Yeah, I don't think Congress is ready for it. There wouldn't be much of a move to get the process started, because politicians would be very outraged. They always say, you're going to have staff basically running the show and lobbyists running the show, but you kind of do now anyway. So it might get marginally better, not marginally worse.
All right. We're going to leave it there. And I'm going to say this. I say it all the time. This has been a good show. Every Business of America is a good show. But Brian, we have to come back and do a show on term limits and how term limits would impact the American economy, how it would impact small business, impact the doers of our economy. So we're going to have the Business of Public Affairs 2 coming up. But I appreciate your time now, Brian. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
All right. This has been another awesome edition, if I don't say myself, of the Business of America. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream